Oh hi, I'm the Heretic. ForeignPolicy.com published an article whose headline asks, "Can social democrats save the world again?" The answer is an obvious no. But for the sake of debunking a lot of mainstream myths derived from your government school social studies textbook and exposing the outright lies put forward from an extremely mainstream philosophy, putting forward antiquated and discredited ideas as hip, cool, and edgy, let's check it out. There's really not much more context you need to know. Hit it!
Socialism is experiencing a resurgence. Polls reveal its growing popularity in the United States, particularly among young people. Popular politicians like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez proudly refer to themselves as socialists, and the press and public intellectuals can't seem to stop talking about it.
Since the author cites Burnout Zero and the Justice Democrats' puppet by socialist, they mean state socialist. Spoiler alert, Kylo Ren dies randomly at the end of episode 9. Also, the article fails to define their terms. It's difficult to address this point without defining what socialism or capitalism means.
The main reason for socialism resurgence is capitalism, or rather, its negative consequences. Economic growth has slowed over the past decades, and its gains have become more unevenly distributed. Income inequality in the United States today is at its highest point since the Census Bureau began tracking it, and the top 1% of Americans control almost as much of the nation's wealth as the entire middle class, according to the Federal Reserve. Rising inequality has been accompanied by rising insecurity.
See? This is what I was talking about. It's impossible to understand what negative consequences means if I don't know what capitalism is. Now, one might think that everyone understands what capitalism means, but it's a politically loaded term, with dozens of different definitions depending on who you ask. So I have to ask, because left-market anarchists, Marxists, and others would say it's the economic system of government-granted monopoly privileges that we have today in the US. Conservatives and libertarians would say it's an economic system characterized by free markets, absent any government intervention, and what we have today in the United States is not capitalism. However, both definitions are mutually exclusive, with no way to refute the other. I suspect the definition they're using in this article is a free market system like what we have in the United States today. This is, of course, a self-contradictory definition, originally put forward by Roger Long, specifically to make the point I am about capitalism being a meaningless term, but you'll see why I claim this definition is being used by the author. Anyways, yes, economic growth in real terms has been stagnant since the 70s, but not for the reasons cited in this article. They go into income inequality. Now, why income inequality? It argues the only way someone can prosper is at someone else's expense. Well, this is a good way to understand statism. Malthusian economics is more discredited than Marxism. The mere existence of technological innovation refutes it. But none of that is ever mentioned. You, dear viewer, are expected to feel envy. You should be outraged. How dare the high-income earners steal from you? You should be envious because of income inequality, so people should be envious because of income inequality, so people should be envious because... This is classical circular reasoning progressives appeal to when explaining why income inequality is a problem. People will act on their jealousies and therefore crime. Put simply, this is emotional manipulation. Progressives want you to feel outrage and envy because when you're thinking emotionally, you're not thinking logically. And if you are thinking logically, then you would reject the government curtailing of your liberty done in the name of eating the rich, even though the net effect will, at best, be no harm done to the rich. The rich mostly achieve their net worth through capital gains, valuation on their illiquid assets such as real estate or shares in a growing company. Their actual incomes, while large, aren't nearly enough to make them billionaires. The way that the income gap is also shown is incredibly dishonest. It presents the wealth of the top 1% and everybody else, and makes you assume that the only reason that they got it that high was through their income, which is demonstrably not the case since income is not wealth. Put simply, this is emotional manipulation. So increasing taxes on the rich doesn't actually do anything to narrow the so-called income gap. In fact, it actually has the opposite effect. It's not that income inequality and wealth inequality doesn't exist, But the fact that it's exaggerated as it is right now is a symptom of a much larger problem. And we all know what that problem is. Say it with me now. The state. Big business interests receive billions in corporate welfare per year from federal, state, and local governments, while also creating restrictions to make competing against said interests much harder, if not outright illegal, giving the government's cronies de facto monopolies. In the absence of government coercion, monolithic businesses would have been competed out of existence a long time ago. A widening gap between the rich and poor is not proof that people have too much liberty. It's evidence of the state's increasing injury to our liberty, more so than any symptom of late-stage capitalism.
Globalization and technological change, meanwhile, have made citizens across the West more uncertain about their and their children's futures.
Made people more uncertain. I love this emotionally manipulative passive language here. People feel uncertain. You can't have greater efficiency in production, higher standards of living, or even be able to feed your family because it'll hurt the author's feelings.
Social mobility has also declined, particularly in the United States, threatening to turn have and have-not into hereditary categories. Today's have-nots, moreover, are not only more economically distant from the haves, and more likely to stay that way than the past, but they are also more likely to lead shorter lives, have physical and mental health problems, fall prey to alcoholism and addiction, and live in broken communities. These developments have created deep divisions and growing frustration in Western societies and proved fertile ground for nativism, polarization, and populism.
Of course they have. Do you think people are oblivious to the plight of their broken communities, plagued with addiction, mental illness, and shorter lives? Alternative narratives to the mainstream explain a lot more and offer actual alternatives to the status quo. Granted, populist and nativist narratives would simply put them in charge of the status quo, institutionalizing their preferences, and would otherwise be unable to address these problems. But as far as what people were told for 16 of the first 20 to 21 years of their lives, while being indoctrinated by the state as a full-time job, it's surely better. But hold on a second. The state indoctrinates people and makes it illegal to not be indoctrinated for the first 16 to 20 years of someone's life as their full-time job. Yet there are still mental health problems, addiction, broken communities, and shorter lifespans. It's almost as if the government is ineffectual at stopping these problems, or maybe they're the cause.
Contemporary capitalism's negative consequences are extensive and disturbing.
Contemporary capitalism? What's that? I don't know. Its negative consequences? I don't know either. But they're disturbing. Ooh, so spooky.
Indeed, during the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was commonly believed that capitalism and democracy could not be reconciled.
Well, you haven't defined your terms, so I don't know. Is a democracy, that is to say a government with rules and or rulers determined by nominal election processes, compatible with a free market? Hell no. Is a democracy compatible with today's neo-mercantilist economy of monopoly privilege? Hell yeah it is.
In order to protect against threats to economic freedom, it might be necessary, as Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, and Milton Friedman and others have suggested, to suspend democracy in favor of some sort of authoritarian liberalism.
Some sort of. Interesting choice of words, because it clearly communicates the author has absolutely no idea what they suggested. Gotta love the passive language. They just suggested their ideas. Anyways, considering that Mises and Hayek explain the economic impossibility of authoritarianism better than any even vaguely mainstream economist, this remark comes off as more than just a little insulting. The worst you could say about Milton Friedman is that he still believed in idea monopolization and central banking, but I know with absolute certainty he would not put forward anything that remotely resembled authoritarian liberalism. But to the meat of the issue. Considering that democracy necessarily implies a central authority to carry out the will of the majority through force, its capacity to harm economic freedom, which, make no mistake, is freedom in its entirety, cannot be underestimated. Whether or not the minority may be enslaved or stolen from is always up for a vote. Damocles' sword hangs over our rights. So if the question came down between choosing democracy or freedom, any rational person would say, screw democracy. It and freedom must always come at each other's expense. So pick one. Because it is impossible to support political democracy and be anything but authoritarian. So I guess I gotta take back what I said about Milton Friedman.
Yet during the 1930s, and especially after 1945, a so-called Great Transformation occurred across the West, enabling democracy and capitalism to be reconciled. One critical reason for this was the triumph of a social democratic understanding of the relationship between the two.
This is a social studies textbook of what happened, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that. No, let me rephrase that. It's actually very simple, but your social studies textbook lied to you. The reconciliation of democracy and capitalism was fascism. I don't mean fascism in the sense of, ooh, he disagrees with me, so I'm going to apply an emotionally charged label onto him. No, I mean honest to goodness, Oswald Mosley style, state-worshipping fascism. Hear me out. A fascist society is a society parasited upon by a corporate state, where economic decisions are planned by business interests, which then advise the rulers on where to allocate resources stolen through taxation, ostensibly to maximize their effectiveness. The business interests, cartels, and monopolies are, in turn, protected by the government, which makes it illegal to compete against them. So how does this relate to what happened in the Great Depression and World War II? Well, let's ask the rulers themselves. FDR, in 1933, is quoted as saying of fascist dictator of Italy, Benito Mussolini, "I don't mind telling you that I am keeping in fairly close touch with that admirable Italian gentleman." And later, "There seems to be no question that he is really interested in what we are doing, and I am much interested and deeply impressed by what he has accomplished and by his evidenced honest purpose of restoring Italy." An advisor of FDR, Rexford Tugwell, who the hell names their kid Rexford, upon returning from fascist Italy, said, "It's the cleanest, neatest, most efficiently operating piece of social machinery I've ever seen. It makes me envious." Imagine being envious of a totalitarian dictatorship. But anyways, words are cheap. So here are actions. The National Industrial Recovery Act, passed as part of the New Deal, created codes of fair competition that cartelized businesses by making it illegal to compete if businesses didn't agree to the wages, prices, or production quotas codified. Businesses in compliance were encouraged to introduce an eerily fascistic blue eagle on their windows. Failure to do so was met with scorn and derision for the lack of patriotism, if not outright hostility from the government. The National Recovery Act was furthermore passed to, in Tugwell's words, eliminate the anarchy of the competitive system. Pamphlets were also distributed under the NRA, claiming that fascism was evolving in America. But hey, don't take their word for it. Mussolini called the New Deal boldly interventionist, having previously defined fascism as the principle that the state no longer leaves the economy to its own devices. He is also quoted as saying of FDR, "Behold, a fascist." The inspiration for many New Deal policies come from central planning both domestic and abroad. The NIRA is modeled after the centrally planned command economy of World War I America, while the Civilian Conservation Corps was inspired by the fascist and Nazi governments drafting their own civilians into public works projects, all modeled around an idea of government-business partnership very much in line with historical and modern fascist philosophy. Now, this is not a criticism of fascism or FDR or his policies, but to characterize them as anything but fascism or even some other form of authoritarianism speaks to either historical ignorance or malice that this author thinks she can pull one over on you, dear viewer. Pointing to a period in history where fascism not only came to power, but became the defining socio-economic policy of the next 80 years in the West, and trying to dress it up and give it a friendly face. Sorry, it's not working this time. Social democrats are the real fascists.
Social democracy is a variant of socialism distinguished by a conviction that democracy makes it both possible and desirable to take advantage of capitalism's upsides while addressing its downsides by regulating markets and implementing social policies that insulate citizens from those markets' most destabilizing and destructive consequences.
Once again, you're not allowed to know what those downsides are. Just believe us when we tell you that it's income inequality. But you aren't allowed to know how the the market causes these inequalities, or why it's a problem. Because we can't make that argument without falling into circular reasoning or admitting that it was the government responsible for literally all these problems. The article presents itself as though regulating markets and implementing social policies is a solution. A solution implies it's not already in place. It's as if markets aren't restricted by governments at all. This is misleading and dangerously manipulative. Trillions of dollars are lost every year in the economy to simply comply with restrictions already in the books. And in the US, you get taxed for the privilege of trading for property, the privilege of owning property, and the privilege of dying having owned property, which is already made more expensive by being taxed at every level of production. So what the hell is this about regulating markets? What economic restrictions, specifically, that aren't already on the books, take advantage of capitalism's upsides while mitigating its downsides, whatever the hell capitalism means? Because now, I want specifics.
The spread of capitalism during the 19th century led to unprecedented levels of economic growth and innovation, but also dramatic inequality, social dislocation, and cultural upheaval. Not surprisingly, a backlash against these conditions quickly developed during the last decades of the century. Karl Marx emerged as capitalism's most powerful critic, establishing his ideas as the dominant ideology of a growing international socialist movement.
Let's try a counter-narrative more accurate to reality. New innovations in agricultural production allow for greater produce to be created by fewer numbers of farmhands. The result was labor freed up from where it was less productive to where it was more productive in the industrial centers of cities. The standard of living skyrocketed in arguably the greatest economic growth period in world history. However, industrialists figured they could make more money by squeezing out their competitors. They first attempted this voluntarily, but found cartel arrangements were fragile at best, as they created incentives for competitors or even cartelists to underbid cartel agreements and make huge profits. Cutthroat competition, that is to say, lowering prices to where competitors couldn't afford to stay in business, was hugely counterproductive, as their larger market share meant the aspiring monopolists lost vastly more money than their smaller competitors. Horizontal consolidation, that is to say simply buying your competitors, didn't work, because all it did was incentivize entrepreneurs to create half-assed businesses, specifically so that the enterprising monopolists would buy them off. Even though the 19th century was hardly a free market, what competition did take place made it clear to business interests that only the government could keep out competition, which they did, lobbying for businesses and rates to be set in the name of consumer protection. This is most prominent in the railroad and banking industries around the turn of the century. Check out Murray Rothbard's The Progressive Era for more info. You can get it for free on Mises.org, so there's no excuse. In railroading, for example, the federal government notoriously stole land from homesteaders and practically gave it away to railroads. If their economic prowess came from government intervention, then their monopoly privilege must stem from it as well. Now, there were people who identified this. Benjamin Tucker and other precursors to left-market anarchists pointed this out, but for some reason, it's Marx who emerges as capitalism's most powerful critic, despite the fact that he was a relative and an employee of the largest banking dynasty in the world, the Rothschilds family, who nowadays own every central bank on Earth save 3 and have funded major political factions throughout the last several hundred years. I wonder if there's a conflict of interest there. Well, I'm sure central banking being a plank of communism in his manifesto is just a coincidence. Also, let's just completely forget about the fact that the media and academia is completely controlled by the government, and there's a reason that Marx is pushed forward so heavily in them. I mean, it's not like Marxism serves the interests of the federal government at all. No, just ignore all that. Naturally, an economy dominated by monopoly privilege, or as it's termed today, public-private partnerships, is going to result in inequality, social dislocation, cultural upheaval, and I would add resource misallocation to that list. But let's just call it what it is. Fascism.
Marxism's power came from its ability to combine a scathing critique of capitalism's nature and consequences with the conviction that they were leading inexorably to its collapse. It was, as Marx put it, a question of laws and tendencies working with iron necessity towards inevitable results. Even after a long depression at the end of the 19th century, however, capitalism showed no signs of inevitable collapse as Marx predicted.
In other words, Marx was wrong. In other news, the sky is blue and Rey is a Palpatine, and I'm spoiling the new Star Wars movie so nobody has to watch it.
Some argued that if capitalism was not going to disappear on its own, socialists should eliminate it by force. The Russian revolutionary and eventual Soviet leader, Vladimir Lenin, was the most important advocate of this view, and his heirs became known as communists. In Lenin's day, however, most socialists rejected his answer and remained committed to a peaceful, democratic path to socialism.
Yeah, and Lenin murdered them, but nonetheless. Peaceful? You think that just because you aren't actively attacking people who disagree with you on the streets, that makes your forcing people to comply with the will of the majority peaceful? Except, you aren't even doing that. Modern democracies have fake elections, where people are lied to about having a choice between two or more pre-selected candidates who will carry out the will of the ruling class, if the election isn't outright rigged in advance. The will of not even the majority, but a tiny minority of ruling elites who can be empirically proven to not care what we think, is carried out by police, who are authorized to do so by any means necessary, up to and including killing you. So yes, they are killing people in the street. It's just that when Bolsheviks do it, we call it oppression and criminal. When armed thugs with uniforms do it, we call it law enforcement. You don't have the moral high ground to claim your brand of violent authoritarianism is any better, nor do you have any consistent standard of right and wrong that we can even compare Bolshevism against. At least Bolsheviks are honest.
The story of socialism during the last century is a story of battle between these alternatives: communism, democratic socialism, and social democracy.
The story of the last century has been Marxism and fascism, competing for the right to conscript brainwashed fools into being maimed, traumatized, and killed in the interests of their rulers, competing for the right to spend other people's stolen money. With the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, fascism won. But fortunately, there is a new path. We can finally be free of these coercive assholes for the first time in human history in 5,500 years.
Recognizing the dangers for democracy and the left of ignoring this suffering and frustration, social democrats argued that the left's most important goal must be using the state to reform and perhaps even transform capitalism. Democratic socialists did not believe this could or should be done, since they viewed capitalism as unable to be fundamentally reformed and doomed to collapse.
The progressive era was when Jim Crow legislation, eugenics, and central planning were the norm. Questions of suffering and frustration were of no consequence to the planners, who saw a future economy as a giant machine to be designed, controlled, and managed by a committee of dispassionate experts who would know how to allocate resources to achieve optimal outcomes. Their solution to social problems was a question of needing the right administrators and bureaucrats for the task. If society were organized along a scientific and hyper-rational basis, it was argued, questions such as class conflict would become non-issues. Reforming capitalism were non-issues to them. The so-called democratic socialists and social democrats had no interest in reform or collapse. Okay, sure, there were rank-and-file progressives to whom reform or collapse did interest them, as did the plight of the less fortunate. However, their thought leaders? They were technocrats, central planners who valued only bureaucracy, administration, and efficiency. So no, they didn't believe their most important goal must be using the state to reform capitalism. They were Adam Smith's men of systems, social engineers with a glorious blueprint of society that completely forgot that individuals are not inanimate pieces on a chessboard, but autonomous entities with their own goals and aspirations that often conflict, no, that always conflict with the interests of central planners. If the planners cared even a little bit, they would have been anarchists. Now the video is running kinda long, so I'm gonna end it here. There will probably be a part 2 to finish off the article, but well, so far it's just been propaganda and historical revisionism to trick us into believing social democracy is a new and revolutionary idea that's been tried before. They want us to believe that World War II was a battle between communism, fascism, and social democracy, and not a battle between fascism and classical liberalism, and that the battle had already been decided prior to World War II.